it has absolute imminent positive consequences when you realize matter doesn't exist.
Yeah, to just throw it out there like that. Like, there you go, man. Matter doesn't exist. Matter has never been found. What we forget is that everything we see that's out there, right, is happening within our consciousness. It's not like it's separate from.
In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers wrote about the hard problem of consciousness. And essentially, it's trying to explain how or why, or how and why, unconscious matter gives rise to consciousness, how something that is fundamentally non-experiential can become experiential. And this seems to be an unbridgeable gap.
The reason that it matters is because it has, the biggest reason is because the answer to this question has a direct bearing on the nature of the self. So if matter is primary, then consciousness is something your body generates, and you are this pile of atoms that we call your body. If mind is primary, right, then your body exists in mind. You are not a separate, peeled off self from the rest of reality, that you are the whole thing. And so it's not that you have consciousness, it's that consciousness has you.
Right out the gate, I think it's important for people to know that we're just regular people who are kind of curious about the nature of reality. Not just kind of curious, but existentially curious. And in that pursuit, we think we've come across some answers that are pretty much the opposite of what everyone else believes.
I think the way that I would describe it is I've not so much come across the answers as I've identified what's definitely not the answer, or that what there's no reason to believe, right? And so, yeah, we are just like regular people in the sense that, like, neither one of us has a PhD in philosophy or something like that. But I think that it's really important for everybody, and it's important for regular people, like, this is the point of this, to examine what they believe and say, and basically say, why do I believe what I believe? Do I have good justification to believe what I believe?
Hmm. Yeah, and it seems to be the case that most people are not doing that, and it's perfectly understandable because most people are just going to work, trying to survive, especially in today's age, right? But it also seems to be the case that if you think critically about these issues for more than 15 minutes, it would lend you into a position that's more like monistic idealism, which is what we lean towards. The other ones are just simply untenable.
Yeah. I think, like, that it's important to point out that although you're just going to work, right, this actually is a problem because you're not paying attention to these sort of basic things that you believe, that are so basic that you just take them to be obviously true. People suffer tremendously, and they act out of these very basic beliefs in a way that that causes harm to themselves and others and all kinds of things. And so I think it's important that regular people think about, like, okay, I think that reality is this way. This is what I believe about reality. That, let's say, just to put something out there, like that, I am this separate piece of matter that generated this mind that I have, that's temporary, and that I view everything else outside of me, and it's all physical. Let's just say something like this, and they just take that to be like, well, obviously this is true. Like, I mean, look, it's true, right? The problem with that is that when you actually look at it, the reasons that you think this are basically just extremely naive.
Yeah, I think the other important thing to point out, the other reason why people aren't really thinking about the nature of reality in their everyday lives is because I think a lot of these things can seem aloof and complicated and not super imminent in that it would have an immediate effect on your life when we start talking about ontology or metaphysics. But because we're going to broach topics like physics, we're going to talk about complicated philosophical concepts. And I think a lot of these things can just seem out of reach for people, but we're kind of here to say, like, it's not out of reach. It's directly understandable by regular people if you commit some time to it. And not only that, it has absolute imminent positive consequences when you realize matter doesn't exist.
Yeah, to just throw it out there like that. Like, there you go, man. Matter doesn't exist. Matter has never been found.
Yeah.
And you're gonna hear something like that and be like, "All right, these guys are crazy."
Hmm.
Like, what do you mean matter
Absolutely.
doesn't exist? And so we'll get into that. What does it mean when you say matter has never been? It's something I like to say, as you know, I like to say all the time to people, like, "Oh, you know this matter stuff you believe in. Matter's never been found. No one's ever
Yeah.
found matter."
Then they
Right?
immediately dismiss you. Yeah,
Sure,
sure.
sure, sure. And I do that to, like, at least, get some attention maybe for a minute. But the I think, to your point, that this can sound just like, all right, this is some kind of philosophical mind puzzle that's interesting, maybe, or maybe not interesting if you're like, something's like, man, I just want to go to work, like you said. But no, like, what you think about the most basic things, who you are, what is this place? What is the nature of reality, right? If you make a mistake at that step, which is like the most basic things you believe about the nature of the world, everything else that's based on that understanding will be wrong. And I think that we see this just not only as like, oh, this is some sort of philosophical curiosity, and like, I want to one up and have the best little logical syllogism that nobody can defeat. It's not that. It's that you're wrong about who you are. You're wrong about what this is. And to be wrong about those things is to not only, like I said, suffer tremendously yourself, but also not be clear about what it is you're doing in your life. We have this thing that people are calling the meaning crisis now, and a lot of people are talking about this. And I'd say that this meaning crisis is the result of these fundamental things being wrong, and just having that snowball into all kinds of other second level problems in life.
Right. So the idea is to be skeptical because confusion and misunderstanding and possibly ignorance causes suffering. And so, that being said, what is the one thing we know for sure?
Yeah, we know that we're conscious.
Absolutely. And so, we have to start constructing our worldview from there, right?
Hey, real quick, no advertisements. I just want to say I really appreciate you hanging out with us, and I would love it even more if you could tickle my algorithm a little bit by pushing some of those buttons down there. We're a brand new show, brand new stuff, looking to do a lot of big things. Hit the like, subscribe. Thanks again.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the way to start, to say, what do I know for sure? What do I just believe, and what do I know for sure? And the one thing that everybody knows is that there's something. It's like there's something going on. There's something happening, right?
Existence exists,
Right,
reality
right,
exists. Yeah,
right, right, right. And so anybody who denies that, which we'll get into later, people do, isn't
absolutely.
being honest, because to deny it itself is a happening. It's something that's happening. And so this is the only thing that we know can't be an illusion, is that consciousness is.
Hmm.
And so I think that any honest ontology has to start there, and this is where we usually go wrong.
Yeah, because after that we start saying, "Oh, well, there's this apparent world that's apparently spatiotemporally located outside of my body, and therefore it's not me." And then what is that world? And it seems like most of the population thinks that it's material, whether it be the religious people or the physicalists, the atheist physicalists. But what we're saying here is that that's not a parsimonious extrapolation. There's simply no reason to think that the quote unquote external reality is of any different essence than I am.
Well, there's certainly, I think, no there's certainly, I think, a temptation to do that,
Hmm.
because it certainly seems that way. Like, this cup here, right? It doesn't seem like me. It seems like it's definitely separate from me. And so it's understandable that, like, on first glance, without thinking about this at all, that we can take it to just be the case. But what we forget is that everything we see that's out there, right, is happening within our consciousness. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like it's separate from. So look, what is the standard sort of worldview nowadays? That's sort of become the story, right? Well, what the story is that there was a big bang, and we don't know what was happening quote before the big bang, but there was a big bang, and a singularity exploded into all of the physical stuff. Well, starting out very simply, hydrogen gas or simple bits of matter that then eventually sort of through gravity and other processes formed larger bodies later on, planets later on, life, and then later on within life a brain, and then later on like a conscious, or maybe with the brain, something that it's like to experience the world. And that is the story that is told, and it's just sort of said, well, yeah, that's what it seems like, that's what it looks like to us. But we forget that all of the evidence for that this stuff that existed prior to consciousness was found within consciousness.
Yeah, I think we'll probably get to the brain conversation at some point. I want to go back to where you said it just seems to be the case that there's this external reality that's made of material. I agree. I mean, you could say that it's just common sense, which is what people tend to lean on. However, there's lots of things that go against common sense that we know to be the case, like Einstein's theory of relativity. Nobody would have thought everybody would have thought that it was common sense that time is not relative. And it turns out to be the case that time is relative to the observer. And it's spooky in a sense. It completely goes against your normal faculties, so to speak. So I don't think common sense, or it just seems to be the case, is really ever a good metric for evaluating some belief that we hold. Do you agree?
It's in fact pretty much always been wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it was
Mm-hmm.
common sense that the world was flat at one time,
Exactly.
right? It was
Mm-hmm.
common sense that Newtonian physics was basically done. It was common sense, that the universe rotates around the Earth, or the sun rotates, around the Earth, or
The
whatever it was.
heliocentric model. Yeah.
And so no, we should never take it's common sense as like or it's the consensus view that should mean that, oh well, it must be true, it's the consensus view. We should never take, to quote Hitchens, we should never take false comfort in this warm blanket of consensus. Like it doesn't, you got to know why you believe what you believe. It's not a good idea to just be like, well, I believe it because people say it, and so it must be the case, and I'm on safe ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so to that point, like what are we doing here? So we talk about this sort of mainstream view now, which is technically called reductive physicalism. And what we're saying is that this is the consensus view. But there's no reason to believe the consensus view when you look more closely at what the consensus view actually entails.
Yeah, it seems to be backwards. It seems to reverse the order of operations. It uses all the stuff that we find within consciousness, and it postulates that stuff exists prior to and independent of consciousness and gives rise to consciousness.
So
There
what is
really
that
is no
stuff, Alex?
no.
What is that stuff? So like when you say it's postulating the stuff, what is it postulating?
Yeah, sure. It depends on who you talk to, but they would just say physical stuff, whether it be matter or fields or energy. Typically, whatever can be described in quantitative terms and is objective, meaning like can be observed from the third person.
It's always when people say, they actually have a hard time when you say to somebody who's saying, well, yeah, I think reality is physical. Duh, it's physical. Like, look here.
Yeah,
It's
right.
physical, right? And you go, okay, well, what actually is that? What is physical, right? It's actually kind of funny because you can watch people struggle, but be like, well, it's stuff it's solid. Okay,
Hmm.
so it's like it involves like you touching it and you determining that it's physical. Well, not quite, like because like it exists without touching it. So okay, so what is it, right? And ultimately, what it ends up boiling down to is that it is fully describable by quantities alone. So we can go from the cup here to the atoms to the subatomic particles, and eventually we get down to nowadays, right, an excitation of a quantum field. And they say that's physical. Okay, what do they mean by that? Well, that's a mathematical description, and it's always, whether I'm talking about this cup's dimensions or its weight or its volume, I'm talking about some sort of numeric quantity that describes what it is.
Hmm. Yeah, what's interesting is when people say the world is physical, they're talking about experiences that they have. But when a physicist talks about physics, it's talking about descriptions of experiences that we have. So, for instance, I lift something heavy. At some point, I ascribe a number to that feeling of heaviness, that experience, that quality of heaviness happening within consciousness. And I say it's 50 kilograms. But what materialism does is say that those 50 kilograms, that number, is actually what's fundamental and gives rise to the experience that created the 50 kilograms. It's like a dog chasing its tail.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple thing that it's obvious that the number 50 doesn't mean anything without creating a scale based on experience in the first place. And then for us to say, well, no, it's the numbers that we get back that experience from. It's so simple that this is obviously backwards, right? And this is where exactly where things go from being, oh yeah, it's common sense, that's physical, it's out there, I know what it is, to wait a minute, I'm saying that numbers are what the world is made out of.
Yeah, so I think it's important to be very clear here that we're not denying that you can have the experience of solidity. What we're denying is that what you experience within your consciousness is what is creating consciousness or generating it.
Right. So this story that I told of the Big Bang all the way throughout the thing, right, is not at all a scientific conclusion or something like that. It's not. It's also really important to recognize that what we're talking about here is not science. The idea that from
Well,
matter you
let's
get.
be clear. Let's be clear. Sorry. The Big Bang Theory is a scientific
Hmm.
conclusion, but what we're extrapolating is not. It's a philosophical
Yeah,
stance, right?
sorry. The idea from that okay, I know that matter, this stuff called matter, is generating subjective experience or generating consciousness, right? Or to say
Hmm.
it simply, I know the brain generates consciousness, right? This is
Hmm.
not a scientific claim. This is merely a belief that someone might have about the nature of reality, and it's a ontological claim, it's a philosophical claim. And so because of that, there's a substitution that takes place though, where because physics deals with the physical, right, that people go, well, if you're making claims about what the brain does or doesn't do, you're basically making a scientific claim all the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and people would be surprised if they start to look into it. The complete absence of any reason or motivation to favor a materialist or physicalist hypothesis about brain generated consciousness or consciousness generated by matter in any shape or form.
Let's be clear about it. Let's be clear about it. Like, this is not coming from science. This belief is not something that science has shown. This is just something that a lot of scientists believe, right? And where does it come from? It does where it does come from is the beginnings of science, and really before that, or not just before that, but all during it, the domination of another worldview, which was the religious one, right?
Hmm.
Which is saying there's this stuff, yes, there's this physical stuff, but then there's this other realm of spirit that created it all, right? And at the beginning, when people were looking to say, hey, I want to like investigate the nature of this physical stuff, they literally were saying, I want to investigate the nature of God's creation, right? And so look to the church, who says we are the explainers of all of this, we are the ones that are in control, like you don't get to do this. They said, no, look, we're just explaining God's creation, we're going to explore God's creation, and we'll just carve out this area of stuff we call physical, that of course, like there's the other realm of spirit, but we'll just carve out this little section and we'll investigate only that. And so that's how it started. But it somewhere along the line moved to, you know what, that other realm that we would just say is mental, not necessarily spiritual, right? That isn't in our picture at all.
Even though the etymology of the word, the spiritual words like soul, go back to psyche and actually just mean mental, right?
Right. So one thing to notice is when we describe reality as physical, as strictly physical, there then becomes this thing that has to happen where you have to somehow find the obviousness. Like we said, consciousness is the most obvious thing there is. You have to somehow find that in that picture that you're now drawing.
Yeah, and it seems obvious to me that people like Aristotle, when they created the physical sciences, knew that physical sciences were not going to be able to capture being itself. It was only going to be able to capture descriptions of behavior, abstract stuff. And so the hard truth here that we're going to have to recognize in the modern world is that you are not going to be able to capture consciousness with quantities. It's just simply impossible.
Right. And so we think that this physicalist ontology needs to be exposed. It needs to be this sort of incoherence, non-parsimonious, just flat out doesn't make sense ontology that everyone thinks is common sense is becoming a big problem, because it never was. It's a rather new way of seeing the world. For the course of human history, there was religion and substance dualism, like we just talked about, mind and matter, or spirit and matter. And physical, like reductive physicalism, is a few hundred years, right?
Mhm.
And as I mentioned, if we are wrong about reality, right, then the actions that we take, and this is very easy to see when you can say, well, we're wrong from the religious sense. And if people believe a bunch of things that are not true, right, this has direct, terrible consequences for themselves, for the people that they're acting upon and controlling. And you don't have to look very far to see some of the horrors of religion, if to the extent that people really believe things that they take to be true without evidence, right? But look, the solution to that is not to come up with maybe less but new beliefs that also we don't know to be true, because no matter what, anytime that we believe something that isn't true, we're automatically not going to be acting out of clear thinking.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you said about how, for the majority of human history, we have largely not been materialist, or especially not physicalist, because that's a very new term. I can hear I can read the comments now in my mind, but the reason why we're materialists now is because materialism has been so successful. Look at you, you're on YouTube, you're using cameras, you're using all this technology. Why is this misguided?
Well, yeah. So what's misguided about that is the idea that science relies on physicalism. Like, in other words, that, well, yeah, it is true that when people started taking this worldview, and look, it could even be said that it was helpful to sort of define the ground of what you're going to be looking at, right? But it was helpful when it was known that it wasn't actually true. It's just a helpful framework, right? But the important point is that science does not rely on physicalism at all. You can do science in another worldview, which we'll get into, but like science predicts the behavior of nature as it appears on the screen of perception. It models and predicts that, and that doesn't require it to tell you what nature is. In fact, it definitely doesn't tell you what nature is.
It definitely doesn't. And I think it's important to point out that there's nothing about science that gives you metaphysical indications that the world just is material outside of consciousness. What we encounter are observations and measurements within consciousness always. And I think you mentioned this earlier in the episode, but this idea that the stuff we encounter, the measurements that we measure, exist outside of us measuring them. It's just kind of asinine to me, but that is the assumption of materialism that's not justified by any science whatsoever. In fact, the science looks like it goes against that. We'll get into the quantum aspect of all this at some point.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can get to the empirical adequacy of physicalism for sure later on, because there's good reason from science to actually say physicalism probably isn't true. Maybe you could even say, if you're really bold, you could say science has falsified physicalism already, actually, because it is true that science can't prove your ontology, but it can falsify it. If the empirical evidence from science basically contradicts what your ontology is, it's the ontology that needs to go, not the science, obviously. So here's what we're not anti-science at all. In fact, as idealists, I would say we love science because it basically fits completely within our worldview without falsifying anything.
I love science. I think we're champions of science.
Yeah, for sure. So
I mean, you're an engineer, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was also a physicalist most of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know what it's like to hold this view. And I remember how obvious it seemed to be true, right? And so I get when people are saying, what are you talking about? You create reality gone mental? Like, you've gone mental, you dumbass, right? like I know I would have been the guy saying that, right? And so I think it's important at the outset here too, to not do what the atheist physicalists do and pretend we don't have a worldview. This podcast is called Reality Gone Mental. What do we think? Well, what we think is that we have it exactly backwards. We think that we have matter that generates mind. The physicalist thinks that matter generates mind. What we think is that that's totally backwards, that it's mind that's primary and matter is an appearance in mind. And we think that this flips on its head, basically, the mainstream view.
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that what we're saying is not as crazy as it sounds. We're saying that reality is natural, just like a materialist or a physicalist would say. We're just saying it's naturally mental. And so what does mental mean? It means phenomenal. It means experiential. It means subjectivity. There's a lot of ways we could cash that out, right? But what we're saying is the fundamental, you could say, substance of reality is consciousness, right?
Yep. And so we start with mind. Mind is the beginning. Just like we said at the very beginning here, what's the most obvious thing that we can't deny? It's that consciousness is, right? And so we think it makes sense to start with what we know. As a scientist, we should want to start with the evidence that we see, and the
Yeah,
evidence that we see.
if you just imagine that you woke up here one day, because you did, and then you start looking out from behind your eyes and trying to build a worldview from there, that's the best way to do it, right?
Right. So what does a physicalist do? Physicalist has the first same two axioms that we would say, which is the obvious one we just mentioned. I am conscious. We know this. Everyone knows this. This is the
I
one
exist.
thing.
I am consciousness. Consciousness exists. There's a few different ways you could say.
Right. But like, that is the one thing that can't be denied. And it's the only thing that doesn't require any inference at all. It's known directly, right?
It can't be denied. It's known directly. It's self-evident, because trying to deny it is incoherent on its face. Trying to deny it is a self-refuting position.
Yeah. If it's an illusion to consciousness. And therefore it doesn't get behind
who
it.
is having the illusion?
Right, exactly. So the physicalist agrees. We agree with this. Second one is that there are other conscious beings, like it's not just me. So this is to escape solipsism, and it is an inference. Why do I think that Alex is conscious? I think he's conscious because in every single way, he's like me in structure and behavior. And do I know Alex is conscious? No. But I think that it's reasonable to assume that he is. And I think the physicalist also agrees with that. And so then this is where the trouble comes in, because the physicalist then goes, okay, I know those two things. I also know that there's a substance called matter, and that substance exists apart from consciousness, because my fourth assumption is that from that stuff, consciousness is generated. So it must exist outside of consciousness. And so when I say matter has never been found, what I mean is, under that definition, this is a substance that exists outside of consciousness, independent of it. That, of course, can't be found, right? And so we would say, well, then there's no reason that we can find to think that it exists.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out the beautiful simplicity and elegance of idealism here in the two premises. So the first one is something that consciousness exists. The second one is like other mind, or mind exists, you could say, and the second one is like other minds exist. In the entailment of that, it's not really a premise, but it's an entailment, which is that we exist in a shared reality. From there, we're just silent because we never left consciousness to begin with. And it's important to know that we can recover all of the empirical observations of the world from just those two postulations without needing to create a new category called matter.
Right. And if we do, so one, it's, if we can do that, we should, for parsimony reasons, right? Number two, we avoid the major problem that comes up when you say there is this stuff outside of consciousness that generates consciousness. We avoid this problem of that incoherent idea you brought up, that this quantitative stuff from this thing that we use to describe reality, right? We can grab from that back the reality that we started with. We avoid this obvious incoherence that's known as the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, and I think we should talk about the hard problem of consciousness because, again, to a lot of people, these philosophical concepts, parsimony, elegance, they might seem like aloof and kind of out of touch. So let's talk about why it's impossible that the brain generates consciousness. So like to kind of give everybody a direction to go, if you want to look for some stuff, in 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers wrote about the hard problem of consciousness, and essentially it's trying to explain how or why, or how and why, unconscious matter gives rise to consciousness, how something that is fundamentally non-experiential can become experiential. And this seems to be an unbridgeable gap because of the assumption that matter exists outside of consciousness and gives rise to that consciousness. There's seemingly nothing about matter that would lend one to logically deduce consciousness from any kind of neuronal activity or any kind of material explanation.
To say that there is to say that the description of a thing is the thing, or from the description of a thing, I mean, it's actually quite simple. The hard problem is that somebody is saying that I can describe something, and then from that description, pull out the thing. So I
Yeah,
can
let's
draw a map. I can use the territory to draw a map. I used the territory first, and I drew this map, and I'm keep drawing it. And if I just draw it detailed enough, that the territory that I use to draw it will come out of the map and actually isn't necessary to precede the map. And I mean, it's as simple as that. That is the claim that's being made. And of course, that will never happen. Another good way to put it that's in just normal language is there ever a detailed enough menu that you could go to and read at a restaurant that will give you the meal, that will fill you up? Is the menu ever the meal? Can you drag the meal out of the menu? And that the impossibility of that is what's being pointed to by saying it's a hard problem. Like, that would be a hard problem if I said to you, go to the restaurant, you get the menu, you can sit at the table, we're going to draw a menu that will basically give you the experience of eating the meal.
mm-hmm.
This is
Yeah,
not a solvable thing.
let's break that down into a little more simplicity, because again, I think that can seem a little high level. So what happens is this: we are conscious, and then we make observations within that consciousness. I run into another person like Brian over here, I cut open his skull, I see a brain. And so I think it's also important to point out that we don't experience reality directly, we experience our experience of reality always and forever, and you're never outside of that. You can't get on the other side of the screen of perception. You can only ever experience reality as it presents to your method of questioning, which is eyes, ears, etc. This is actually a quote from Werner Heisenberg. But so that being said, what I'm seeing when I see your brain is an abstract representation of what reality actually is as it presents to my method of questioning, which is my sense. There's no real reason to believe that that's reality as it is in and of itself. And there's no real reason to believe that that stuff is what's generating your consciousness. So essentially what we have is I have a brain that I observe, which is already an abstraction. It's not reality in and of itself. And then we have neuroscience, which describes the brain in terms of measurements like neuronal activity, frequencies, etc. And then we try to use those descriptions of the description to generate the experience theoretically, right? We're catastrophically mistaking the map for the territory. Multiple layers of it.
This is not complicated, actually. It's sort of complicated. The reason it sounds complicated to most people is because their assumptions about what this stuff is and how it works are so deeply embedded that it's impossible for them to actually question them, because like they take them to be true no matter what, right? And so, but it's really simple. It's that we are saying with physicalism that the description of the thing is the thing, not the thing itself. And this isn't true, is the problem. And so once we make that mistake, we now have this seemingly insoluble problem. And then people go, hey, why don't we know what consciousness is? Why don't we know, like, why is consciousness not in the picture? Why is there no scientific theory of consciousness? There must be something wrong. We must not be working on this hard enough. And what are they doing? if you're looking to science to discover the nature of consciousness, what you're doing is saying, I'm going to try to solve the hard problem. Well, what does that mean? That means I'm going to get the meal out of the menu, and I'm going to keep working at it until someday the territory falls out of the map. And then we wonder why we're not making progress, and why we've made such strides in physics, which doesn't rely on this substitution that we're making here. And so we should be able to also make, because consciousness must just be a physical thing, we should be able to figure this out. And then when we run into difficulties, we just say, well, it's really complex.
Yeah, we're not just saying it's a hard problem. We're saying it's a completely unsolvable problem because it relies on metaphysical commitments that are incoherent.
Right. I mean, and really it comes down to this. We have this thing that I mentioned. We have matter and mind, and we say matter generates mind. It's that order of operations that causes this problem. If you flip the order and you say mind actually generates matter,
Or the
then
appearance of.
you have a problem still. You have to explain, how does mind generate matter, which we're gonna hopefully do on this podcast with our Reality Gone Mental. But what you don't have, so you have that problem, you have to explain it, but that problem doesn't have the hardness to it because we haven't mistaken the map for the territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are many problems with physicalism or materialism, but and I'm sure we'll like beat those dead like horses. But let's talk about monistic idealism. We're particularly fond of the contemporary philosopher Bernardo Castro. I think we both think that he pretty much has it nailed, especially with regard to this postulate of dissociation, which you just talked about, mind generating matter. So maybe we could get into that a little bit. What do you mean mind can, if I were to say something like mind can in fact generate matter, but matter can't generate mind, like how would you break that down?
Well, there's a problem with what I said already, right? And that is sort of granting matter as a thing, as something that actually exists. So I think the simplest way, and the one that I always like to use to sort of describe what I mean by that statement, is something that everyone's experienced, which is having a dream. And so in a dream, you, assuming it's not a lucid dream, you fall asleep and you become a character in this dream. You become a separate point of view in a world that you're dreaming of, and there's you, this character that has this point of view, and you have all of the physical world of the dream, the apparently physical world to the dream character, right? But if we look at what that actually is, right? So all that is the mental activity. It's mental processes in the mind of the dreamer, right? None of that is actually physical. So when I say mind generates matter, what I mean when I say that is that matter is an appearance in mind, and it's an appearance of mind in mind. There's nothing ontological about it that is this matter that would say it exists as an actual thing. There's no tearing apart the head of the dreamer and finding this matter there, right? There is mental processes that look to the dream character like matter. And this process, you mentioned the word dissociation. Falling asleep and becoming a character is to forget who you are. It's to then dissociate into a very small section of your mind that is now fully contained within that dream. And that is a mental process of dissociation that we see happen, like I mentioned, in a dream. It's a normal thing that happens in the nature of mind. And so we think it's through this process of dissociation that the physical world appears to exist.
Yeah, so let's back out a little bit. What we're saying is that reality is mental. We're saying that mental processes, and those processes appear to dissociated alters like you and I differently depending on what kind of mental processes they are, you could say. But in that appearance is matter, or quote unquote physical, but it's an illusion.
It looks like matter, right? And so what is matter? Matter is what a mental process looks like to sense perception of a dissociated alter. In other words, a dissociated point of view occurs, a mental process of dissociation, and then from that point of view, other mental processes are what matter looks like. Or I should say, got that wrong. Those mental processes are what we call matter. That's what those mental processes look like, is what we call matter. And so what is matter? It's an image, it's an appearance, it's not an actual thing.
Yeah, what basis do we have to say that, right? Like people are like, what are you talking about?
Well,
Like
for
what do
one
you
thing,
mean?
matter is always found in sense perception. Like every experience of matter that's ever been had has happened in sense perception, right? The claim of physicalism is that this matter exists objectively outside of perception, right? But there's no evidence of such a substance. There's no way you could even have evidence of such a substance. It's a conceptual abstraction.
It's actually worse than that. It's not just that it's a claim that can't be verified. It's a claim that specifically should not be believed because we have good empirical evidence to suggest that what we experience in our day-to-day or in every waking moment is an abstract representation of reality, not reality in and of itself. We have a screen of perception that mediates our interaction with the quote unquote exterior world. There is no good reason to believe that screen of perception is an accurate representation of sort of like the ontological nature. But not only that, we know that our sensory perceptions have developed, evolutionarily speaking, to show us reality in a way that helps us survive, not that shows us truth. So, this idea of physicality to me seems like a finite mind interpreting infinity, and that just happens to look like physicality.
Needs to be, put an exclamation point on it. Why would we think that our sense perceptions were an ape that evolved on a rock,
It seems absurd.
in the solar system? Why would we think, like, why would we just take it to be true that, yeah, we're equipped with these sense perceptions to investigate the nature of reality as it is? It doesn't even make any sense. And so, look, when matter is found, it's found in sense perception. The world to me looks like it looks because of my sense perception, right? The world to a worm does not look like it looks to me, right? Because of its sense faculties and whatever that is. But we take it to, for some reason, think we are the final boss of evolved sense perception that can see the world exactly as it really is.
The final boss. Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about here because I can read the comments already. So you're saying reality doesn't exist when you're not looking? No, of course not. So like, I like to bring up like, what is the moon when not perceived? You could say when nobody's looking. And usually people respond by saying, it's still the moon. Duh. And I'm like, okay, but what is that? How would you describe the moon? The point here is that reality doesn't change based on who's looking, but the way reality appears does depend on who it's appearing to and what sensory modalities they're equipped with. Like it just seems obvious, right?
Yeah, for sure. And so what we're not saying is that there's no world outside of my mind or your mind because people will say this too, that, oh, you're a solipsist. You're saying that like, the world only exists in your mind. No, we're saying that there's a world out there, if you will, out there, meaning outside my finite mind. But that world, the nature of that world is mental. It's not physical. You can't ascribe physical properties to it because physical properties come about from sense perception.
Physical properties are a product of sense perceptions. Physical properties do not exist independent of mind.
And you can say, well, yes, they do, but then it's on you to show why, like, evidence for that claim, right? And in fact, if you look at empirical evidence, when we start to look at dig the nature of particles as far as we can go, we find an emptiness that comes up that doesn't comport with that. And not only that, pretty much says that that's not the case, that there is no objective existing physical properties outside of sense perception.
So this is a really crazy idea, though, to think that consciousness could be primary and that matter is an illusion. Is there any way to bring this down to earth? And what are the, I think it's important to also talk about, what are the immediate implications of this on ontology.
Yeah, like, why is this important? Why do we want to do this podcast, right? Like, so
Mhm.
because it all sounds like, oh, kind of interesting, guys. Like, okay, like you're positing this really weird alternative to what seems to be common sense, like, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that again, fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality basically color everything else that you do. Well, that they color what's important in life, what is important for the day, what is important to do today, what could we be doing, what should we be doing to find fulfillment and happiness in life, right? Like, and it may not sound like that on the surface, like, okay, there's this weird philosophical conversation about whether or not mind or matter is primary, but the reason that it matters is because it has, the biggest reason is because the answer to this question has a direct bearing on the nature of the self. So if matter is primary, then consciousness is something your body generates, and you are this pile of atoms that we call your body. If mind is primary, right, then your body exists in mind. You are not a separate, peeled off self from the rest of reality, that you are the whole thing. And so it's not that you have consciousness, it's that consciousness has you. And that has vast implications for who you are, what's happening here, what death means, and what life means.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that everybody has a worldview. Some of us don't think about it critically, but we still walk around with maybe somewhat of a default. Maybe you grew up in a religious family, and so that's your worldview. Maybe you grew up in a secular household, and so that's your worldview. Even though some people would claim that atheism is just a lack of belief, but the majority of them are reductive physicalists or some kind of
Well,
physicalist
even
or
if they're
materialist.
not, like just to not interrupt you, but like
Hmm.
there'll be an implied understanding that's not acknowledged about what the world actually is in that case. Like, no, somebody that claims, well, I don't think anything about the world, wouldn't be able to put the food in the right mouth hole if
Yeah,
they
let
didn't
me
think
let me
anything.
let me be very clear. If somebody says I have no worldview, followed by consciousness is generated by the brain, those two statements are contradictory,
Yeah,
right? If you
for
say
sure.
that consciousness is generated by the brain, that is a worldview.
Yeah,
I just want I want everybody to be very aware of this.
yeah.
But so that being said, like what you believe about the world, either implicitly or explicitly, changes the way you move around the world in every way. It's much more profound and imminent and important than most people give it credit for.
To try to bring that down to earth too, let's just go back to the dream, because when you're if you're in a dream, right, if reality is like what we described as being mental, and there being a mind that's dissociated into separate points of view, like you and me, right? Well, when you have a dream, you've dissociated into a separate, apparent separate point of view. Let's say that dream is a nightmare, right? Or let's say it's even not. Whatever's happening in that dream is is a problem or not a problem for that dream character in the dream. And it could be a big problem. Anybody who's had a nightmare is living through this suffering that happens in the dream, right? And if you are to, in the middle of that dream, change and make it become a lucid dream where you know you're dreaming now, the impact of all of the problems that that character had is completely different. You know that this is now a temporary situation, that isn't actually real at all, right? And so the implications on what you think about your situation is completely different, right? Or, and anybody who's woken up from a dream and gone, oh, I'm glad. I've totally forgot who I was. I was having this nightmare, and now I realize that's not who I am, right? You can obviously see like the profound implications on how you're viewing what's happening to you in those two different, scenarios. So like, look, I think this is really important to kind of put put a pin on this, that we're not talking about this because we think we've got a cool philosophy that everyone should believe, and look at us, we're so edgy, and matter doesn't exist, and ha ha ha. No, we're talking about this because the mistakes we make about this literally impact the most important thing to everybody, which is their peace, fulfillment, and happiness that they're missing out on by worrying and worrying about the past, or lamenting the past, worrying about the future, spending all of their time confused about who they are and what's going on here, and suffering tremendously because of it. And Yeah, so I think that's why we want to do this podcast. That's why we want to say, hey, this very fundamental things. Are you sure? Are you sure you know that you exist and you're this separate thing? Are you sure you know that reality is physical? Because you better be, because it's causing you an unbelievable amount of anxiety.
Yeah, in case anybody hasn't picked up on it yet, what we're talking about here is a modern, rigorous philosophical recapitulation of Advaita Vedanta, oneness, mysticism, you could call it, as espoused by Bernardo Kastrup. And so, like, the entailment of this worldview is essentially unconditional love, unlimited compassion. We just think it would be like a really good thing for the world if everybody realized they were believing in things that didn't make any sense.
Yeah, and to I want to talk about like Castrop and what's going on here in terms of why we want to communicate it this way. I think that like you hit the nail on the head that we're talking about something ancient. This isn't something new. This is something that people have known for a long time. There's mystical traditions in all of the religions. They're usually persecuted, killed, thought of as fringe and whatnot, and or in the worst cases, like essentially killed. But in the East, there's vast traditions that basically have this worldview. And what is the worldview? That mind is primary and matter is secondary. There's a reason that the Buddhists and the Hindus say meditate, look at your mind, because that's not just a exercise for the individual. That is an investigation into the nature of reality as they see it. So where Bernardo comes in is that this message always needs to be communicated. It's a very counterintuitive message, and it needs to be communicated in a language that people that in cultures will understand. And in our modern physicalist culture, in scientific-based sort of scientism-like culture, this needs to be communicated in a rigorous way, as you said, right? And we think that it's not the Bernardo Kastrup. This isn't Bernardo Kastrup's grand idea and theory of everything. This is a very old, very common philosophy that comes up in all cultures, a lot of times known as the perennial philosophy, that is just given a modern description that can help people to see it, that are sort of locked into beliefs and assumptions about the nature of reality. And so we think Bernardo does a great job of that. It avoids all of this baggage that comes with what people think various religious traditions or cultural baggage that comes with other tellings of this. And we think that in this modern sort of Western scientific physicalist worldview, this is the only way people can hear it.
Yeah, shout out to Bernardo. If you want to be a guest, hit us up, man. Yeah, just kind of on the side, did you want to cover anything else? Because I have like a sort of closing thing I want to do, but I don't know if
I think we're good. Yeah, I like it so far. Let's do a
Okay.
closing thing, whatever you got.
Okay, so let's give the audience or commenters a chance to vote on something. I'm going to say what I want the next episode to be about, and then you can say what you want it to be about, and then we'll let people vote on that. So what I want to cover in episode 2 would be something along the lines of the decades of tests involving entangled photons that apparently invalidate or falsify physicalism by way of Bell's inequality, quantum stuff, essentially. Full disclosure, I'm not a physicist, but that's okay. We have vast resources available to us. What about you?
So I think that to give an alternative, I mean, I'm happy to talk about the science and what science says about physicalism. So I think that's a good topic. But I think that focusing also in on the incoherence of physicalism and how idealism isn't incoherent or doesn't like to sort of further flesh out why putting mind before matter doesn't entail the same kind of problems, and getting more into like, okay, how do we then as idealists explain the problem for idealism is idealism saying there's only one mind. Why does there appear to be all this multiplicity? And so that is the quote problem for idealism to solve. Like I already mentioned, it's not a hard problem in the way that explaining mind from matter is. So I'd like to get into that.
Okay, so if you've made it this far, thank you so much for hanging out. Make sure to tickle our algorithm by pushing some of those buttons down there. Like, subscribe. We're a brand new podcast. We would love to have you on board. Thanks. Peace out. Gotta end it. I can't end it.